Welcome to Joint Session Diverse Voices in New York State Cannabis, the podcast where policymakers, legislators, thought leaders, licensees, and advocates come to discuss the evolving landscape of cannabis in New York and beyond. I'm Herb Barbot, former Director of Operations at New York's Office of Cannabis Management. Each episode, we bring you in-depth conversations with key voices shaping policy, business, and advocacy, plus expert insights on the latest developments impacting the industry. And now for the episode. Welcome to episode 5 of season 2 of Joint Session. This is Herb Barbot, and in this episode, we'll speak with Scheril Murray Powell Esq about the history of cannabis prohibition in New York and across the country. But first, let's take a spin around this week's news. Late last week, Donald Trump signed an executive order on making the District of Columbia safe and beautiful. While the order has nothing to do with cannabis and really nothing to do with making D.C. safe and beautiful, an accompanying fact sheet notes that D.C. decriminalized marijuana as an example of how its failed policies opened the door to this order. Legalization opponents cheered at this language and are also celebrating Trump's nomination of Sarah Carter as the new head of the Office of National Drug Control Policy. Carter is, surprise, surprise, a Fox News contributor who has occasionally reported on cannabis through the lens of cartel activity and illegal grows. Otherwise, her drug policy experience is limited, and there are few public indications of her views on regulated cannabis. CNN also published a story this week about a pro-cannabis PAC's efforts to sway Trump and Republicans with pro-cannabis ads, which contained a few previously unreported but newsy nuggets. But most importantly, a White House official said no action is being considered at this time on marijuana. In Smokelahoma, which is a medical cannabis-only state, officials held a press conference to share the findings of a new report that sheds light on just how sprawling illegal cannabis activity has become in the state. We've been called the Wild West of marijuana for years now because we are wide open, said United States Senator James Lankford. One big takeaway from the report released by Texoma HIDTA, which stands for High Intensity Drug Trafficking Area, is that there is 32 times more cannabis produced by licensed entities than is necessary to meet licensed patient demands. That means that marijuana is going somewhere. It's going outside the state of Oklahoma and is presenting a huge public safety threat, not only to Oklahoma, but outside the state of Oklahoma, said Texoma HIDTA Executive Director Keith Brown. Donnie Anderson, the director of Oklahoma Bureau of Narcotics, shared a figure that is not included in the report. We can't account for 70 million pounds, he said. So what do? We provided a safe haven, basically, under the laws that we have for criminal organizations. The speakers called on lawmakers in the state to place a limit on how much cannabis can be grown in the state. In Germany, cannabis is legal, but retail sales aren't yet, as the country is taking a slower, two-phase approach. In the recent election, the Christian Democratic Union and Christian Social Union parties, which are center-right and strongly oppose legalization, took power. We want to reverse the mistake of the Traffic Light Coalition and ban cannabis again, Bavaria's Interior Minister, Joachim Herrmann, told a major German regional daily. Bavaria's Health Minister, Judith Gerlich, told the paper, with the Traffic Light Coalition, their dangerous cannabis misguided course has also been voted out. Gerlich continued, the change of government offers the opportunity to end the trivialization of this dangerous drug and to ensure greater health protection, especially for children and young people. Back in the U.S., in February, Delaware's adult use market, legalized in 2023, appeared on track for launch. But this week, the Office of the Marijuana Commissioner shared an unexpected curveball. The FBI denied its request for an FBI service code to conduct the statutorily required criminal background checks for the adult use recreational marijuana market. Now, the office needs to work with lawmakers and said it plans to work expeditiously to develop proposed legislation containing criteria that is satisfactory to the FBI. Of particular relevance to a bill proposed by New York State Governor Hochul that is still being debated during the ongoing and late budget negotiations, the Supreme Court of Michigan says cannabis smell doesn't okay a warrantless search. The Michigan Supreme Court ruled 5-1 last week that the smell of cannabis does not justify a warrantless search of a car by law enforcement. In 2020, Jeffrey Armstrong was hit with gun charges after police searched his car. But as the judges noted, voters legalized cannabis in 2018. In light of these statutory changes, although certain conduct related to marijuana use is still prohibited, the smell of marijuana standing alone no longer constitutes probable cause sufficient to support a search for contraband. Because the alleged basis for the officer's search of the automobile in this case was the smell of marijuana standing alone, the search was not constitutional under the automobile exception to the warrant requirement, wrote Justice Megan Kavanaugh on behalf of the majority. This is the second ruling of its kind in just a few months. In September, the Illinois Supreme Court also ruled on a case involving the warrantless search of a car. The laws on cannabis have changed in such a drastic way as to render the smell of burnt cannabis standing alone insufficient to provide probable cause for a police officer to search a vehicle without a warrant, they wrote. Now, coming back to New York, Tashida Dawson, New York's founding director of the Department of Small Business Services Cannabis NYC, announced that she's departing. Dawson stated, "My focus now shifts toward elevating my impact and influence within the cannabis industry on a broader scale, both at state and federal levels." A few days later, the New York Times reported that Dawson had resigned amid a sexual harassment investigation. Dawson has denied any wrongdoing. We will most certainly hear more about this in the coming weeks. As always, thanks to Cannabis Wire for that news. Check out Cannabis Wire at cannabiswire.com. I'd like to welcome Scheril Murray Powell to Joint Session. Scheril is a multifaceted legal professional renowned for her expertise in agricultural, cannabis, dietary supplement, regulatory, and trade law. Scheril was elected as the International First Vice President and Local 12 President of the Ethiopian World Federation, Inc., and is the founder of the Cannabis HR Council. She is also on the board of one of the longest-serving cannabis advocacy organizations, Patients Out of Time. She is regarded internationally for her work on policy related to global tribal community rights and the sacramental use of cannabis. Scheril has been named one of the top 12 cannabis attorneys in Florida by the Daily Business Review and honored in the High Time 100 most influential African Americans in the history of the United States with regards to drug and cannabis policy. Her dedication extends to volunteering with the Windrock Foundation, delivering marketing training to farmers in Ghana, Africa, and teaching. This is the most important thing, I'm sure, and Scheril would agree, teaching debate class at her son's school. Thank you, Scheril, and welcome.
Thank you for having me, Herb. It's so good to be on your show. So thank you. All those things are true. And as you said, teaching debate, and today's Thursday, so I always teach on Thursdays. This very special for me.
All right, so we're here to talk about the history of cannabis prohibition in New York. But before we get to the actual questions, I'll give a quick sort of Wikipedia for listeners to keep in mind that the alcohol prohibition went from the 18th Amendment in 1919, and ended with the 20th Amendment in 1933. So that's sort of the context that it's happening nationally. So prior to 1914, cannabis was actually legally available in New York State. But then in 1914, New York began requiring a prescription to purchase cannabis. Between 1914 and 1927, only 4 articles appeared in the New York press that even mentioned cannabis. Then in 1927, New York restricted cannabis completely. And I believe that at the federal level, it was 1937. An interesting fact was that in 1937, our mayor, the famous Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia, established a committee to investigate the cannabis issue. That committee worked for 5 years, and 5 years later, they issued a report that found in 1944, they found that the gateway theory was false, and that cannabis use was not associated with either addiction or juvenile delinquency. In 1973, the Rockefeller drug laws were established, and that established a penalty for selling 2 ounces of cannabis or possessing 4 ounces of cannabis required a minimum of 15 years in prison and a maximum of 25 to life. Forward to July 2014, Governor Cuomo signed the medical cannabis bill. And then, of course, in March of 2021, the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act came into being. That's a quick Wikipedia recitation of the history. But what I wanted to focus on with you, thank you. What I wanted to focus on with you, Scheril, and again, thank you for being on. How did racial and cultural factors influence cannabis prohibition in New York specifically? and then sort of, if you can, compare it to what was happening at the national level.
Yeah, thank you for that. So this is such a significant topic. Just talking about, the underlying racism with regards to prohibition of cannabis. So as you mentioned, prior to the early 1900s, cannabis was used medicinally. It was in tinctures. It was all used for medicine. It was used for specific indications, female issues, headaches, insomnia, a number of things. So it's been well studied. It's tied to indigenous community for millennia. And then we get to this point where, based on economics, there's a restriction on that industry. It's very interesting that you kind of highlighted the end of alcohol prohibition and how that related and tied into the beginning of cannabis prohibition. As we know, when you're in the what they call the vice industry, the vice business, you're going to see that type of opposition. And again, it comes straight down to economics and financials. Um, we even saw that when we started seeing the beginning of the end of prohibition across the United States, where the opposition came from the gambling industry. It's like, why would the gambling industry oppose the legalization of cannabis? They're not the same thing, but it's just being in that vice space. And also, in casino environments, people who are drinking, their judgment is affected in a way that their judgment isn't affected by cannabis. So it was really eye-opening to see that the opposition to cannabis legalization came from the gambling movement. When we talk about those times in the United States, specifically in New York, specifically Uptown and Harlem, there was a thriving jazz community. A great place to do a deeper dive on this history is looking and what you can watch it is Fab Five Freddy, who's a friend. His documentary on Netflix, is called Grass is Greener. And he takes us through that period of, prohibition and the jazz musicians who were known for it, some of the greats, even, Louis Armstrong. And, at the same time as we're having this jazz movement in New York, in Harlem, Uptown, there's also a similar activity, which people don't really talk about, happening in New Orleans as well. So New Orleans has a very significant jazz-related cannabis history that isn't often spoken about. I learned about that when I spoke at it was a Black Cannabis conference, and then we had a few panels on site, off site, and then there was this emergence of the fact that cannabis is so entrenched in New Orleans history because they're known for their jazz culture. So I think there's definitely that connection with the jazz musicians, that Harlem Renaissance period, where you have this infusion of world-renowned creatives of African descent being in one place, collaborating with each other, and the efforts to kind of lock that down, restrict that type of activity. There's another movie that I would highlight for individuals to take on. This is a Hulu movie now, so I'm showing love to Netflix and Hulu, but it's the United States versus Billie Holiday. So in this movie, it's a phenomenal cinematic treasure. And in this movie, you get to experience that jazz period and understanding Anslinger. So in our cannabis movement, Anslinger is this villain, because he, was responsible for the DEA, and he put in these draconian rules and laws, and did some really horrendous things. Well, you get to see it personalized and humanized in this movie, where Billie Holiday, she's known for a very famous song. It's called Strange Fruit. And Strange Fruit is about her experience traveling as a singer, going through the South and seeing literally people, Black men who had been lynched, hanging from trees. So that's what Strange Fruit is about. And when what would happen is, she created this song. It was a homage to those of us who have lost people, and the fact that in the South, the dirt is drenched with our blood, people of African descent's blood, and these lynchings, and how it was an activity or entertainment for white people in the South. Almost like, even looking at the breakdown of the word picnic, which is like pick a N word, all of that is kind of brought to the surface with her singing the song. Anslinger took such offense to her singing this song that every time she would sing this song, she risked being arrested. So there was a whole national plot against this singer to stop her from singing this song so that they would pin drug related charges on her. Now, she did have addiction issues, but she was specifically targeted. Individuals around her were put around her to frame her for being caught with cannabis, heroin, etc., even to her husband being someone who was a plant at a time in her life. So there was this campaign to keep her from singing this song, which indirectly is related to prohibition. And as a singer back in those days, you needed to have like a permit to perform. So they would take actions and have her arrested to restrict her access to have this permit so she would not be able to work. So that's just one depiction, which I think is really well presented, so that you can walk through what it was like to be in Harlem as a jazz musician that utilized cannabis for your creativity, is part of your social scene, and being targeted by one of the highest government officials, to the point that even in her passing and death, she was they intentionally kept medication from her to exacerbate her medical issues, so she ultimately died. So that's how devious it was as far as the efforts around prohibition, and that's how tied it was to racism, covering up racism, not allowing some type of uprising through exposure to music and things like that. But it's very commonly known that cannabis at that time was associated with people of color, whether it's people from Mexico as coming in as migrant workers and coming in as philosophers and poets.
I wanted to ask that. So, in addition to
Yes.
the jazz and popular culture, what about sort of the immigrants coming in, right? Whether it's from from Central America, from Africa, from Latin
Yes.
America.
Yeah, so first of all, an African presence on this continent and in the Americas predates Columbus for sure by many many years. There is in the Ethiopian World Federation, one of our um, scholars and one of our members, he's actually our envoy to Ethiopia. He did a presentation on Congo and Congolian ties to Ethiopia. And there's evidence of Congolians coming to the Americas very early and bringing, as part of their rituals and their ceremonies, cannabis. So that origin, we can tie that cannabis spiritual sacramental culture to the Congo, predating Columbus, predating colonialism, and they brought that to the Americas, and that's why we have that presence today. In addition to our Asian community coming in indentured servitude, also bringing over cannabis as a sacramental, spiritual, and ceremonial practice. So we saw that. And then we have coming over from Mexico, which we share a border with. We saw migrant workers, but also, I think it's stereotypical and racist to even assume that all Mexicans coming over were migrant workers. There were wealthy Mexicans who came over, who owned properties and homes, and again, philosophers, poets, business entrepreneurs, and that was part of their cultural practices as well. But definitely cannabis for our culture and for the working class has been a source of rejuvenation, relaxation after work hours, and that was a part of the culture with the Mexican community. Hence the name marijuana, which some people refuse at this point to say marijuana because of the racist undertones. It doesn't bother me, but I accept and I understand it. But just evangelizing this mighty plant as marijuana for a more homogeneous America, where foreigners were foreign, foreigners were alien, and in that time we didn't have the travel that we have now. We didn't have this melting pot society that we have now. So people in certain parts of this country may have never seen a Black person, or they may have never seen a Mexican person. So when you promote these stereotypes and then associate a product, an agricultural product, with that stereotype, and even create additional stereotypes. So when we talk about the movie Reefer Madness, some of the things that were heavily suggested in Reefer Madness is that it makes you lazy. And, again, when you look at the communities that built this country, built this state, this state was built on the backs of Black and brown people. They were the builders, they were the workers, they were the architects, they were the tradespeople. So to, in one breath, say, these are the people who work until we say stop working, but they're lazy, is contrary, but no one confronts that. So there's this assertion that, it causes laziness, it causes a certain type of ambition for Black men to want to be with white women, and white women to want to be with Black men. And it's just really triggering people's fears and their insecurities, and using that as a target to create this environment of non-acceptance. And then we have, as I mentioned, the economic piece of it, where you have these communities that you don't traditionally see as the big spenders in the economy, that are utilizing this plant for their health well-being, meaning they're not purchasing these other more pharmaceutical in the corner store, what they used to call it at the time, these convenience stores products. This is something they can grow themselves. This is something that they are trading amongst themselves. So there's a bartering and trading system, which is very consistent with traditional African culture, and indigenous culture. So there's like another economy happening based on this plant. Even in Jamaica, there's a self-sustaining community that existed called Pinnacle, and Pinnacle was based on a marijuana economy. That's what sustained the people and everyone in that particular area. So to suppress that, just like a Black Wall Street would be burned, this plant was restricted. Access was restricted, and the commercialization of it was restricted. So now you become more dependent, and the information is put out there that these pharmaceutical things, this is where you get good health. This is what's acceptable. There's no smell. And then you're migrating this economy that existed to your economy that helps with your, fattens your pockets. And this is done legislatively. This is done through media. This is done through criminalization, and it's creating all these profit centers as a result of restricting access to the plant. So you've created a profit center in pharmaceuticals. You've created a profit center in incarcerated Black and brown bodies. And then when you talk about the expansion of the medicinal or consumable plant version of the plant, or that type of plant genetic that is typically consumed, the flower of the plant, etc. When you consider that compared to the expanded 25,000, 50,000 ways of using the cannabis plant, because there's at least 25,000 uses for it, and only one is really consuming, right? And it used to be mandated that you grow hemp in this country. So you go from that environment to like, hey, we're going to elevate this, you know, thing we're calling plastic. We're elevating this, and we're elevating paper because we own the refineries for paper and paper production. Again, economics. So how do we take this other parallel economy that we don't have restrictions on? Again, when you look at hemp production, the cycle of a hemp plant is what, 3 months, whereas growing a tree can be 10 years, 20 years for a tree. So if you want the land you own for with growing trees, your a refinery plant for making paper to succeed, you have to suppress this fast industry, which anyone can pretty much participate in, and restrict that so that those funds, that economy, that all flows into your particular commercialization of various other commodities, pharmaceuticals, paper products, plastic products, which now we know to have carcinogenic properties. So
So moving forward to the 1970s and the famous or infamous Rockefeller drug laws, how
yeah,
does that, how did those laws affect communities? What was the sort of impact on enforcement and on our local communities?
Yeah, I think when you put laws in place like that, those type of draconian rules, it allows for individuals with what we call non-mutable characteristics to be targeted. So, I was born a black baby. I grew up to be a black woman. You look at me and you're not like, I wonder if she's a. No, it's pretty much very clear. So I can't mute it. There are other, things that you can change and alter, but my skin tone isn't one of them. Typically, without even with lighting creams, white creams, I'm still going to present as a black woman, and a black man will present as a black man, and those are things that were utilized to have stop and frisk related activity over policing in certain communities, and again. Black and brown bodies became a profit center through for the legal community. So by being, having to pay for a lawyer to have a chance to not go to prison, black and brown bodies were used to feed the military. So if you have a cannabis charge, we'll give you a deal, join the military, and then we'll make it go away.
Yeah, I mean, and that was very common. I'm not sure people appreciate that, but that was a very, the judge would say, instead of
Yes.
this, there's the U.S. government, right? So
Yeah, absolutely. So we basically, those who had an affinity with cannabis, whether it's because we're immigrants coming in, or we come from indigenous culture, because of our non-mutable characteristic, we were targeted and fed right into this profit center for the rest of the mainstream community. And then again, talking about the 70s, that's when we're starting to see more Caribbean people coming over. That's when we're seeing the significant growth of Rastafarianism. So, as Rastafari myself, one couple things I can say is one, everybody, when you people are reflecting, they're nostalgic about good weed during the 70s and 80s. They say, "Oh, I bought from that Rasta guy. I bought my weed from Jamaicans." That kind of thing. So again, having your locks, your crown, that's another non-mutable characteristic that they'd be like, "Oh, they use it for their holy sacrament. We have laws against it. We're going to target they most likely this person we well, like with finding a black person, they might or they might not have cannabis on them. Finding a black person who is Rastafari, the chances increase significantly, and then you again feed these bodies into the profit center that sustains the world, sustains the legal community, sustains the courts, sustains the police precincts, and you're just using them to make money.
yeah, no, and it's interesting because it's already one of the things that New York State is dealing with since the MRTA is there are some prisons upstate that have closed, and now the communities are sort of wondering what they can do with this property, but the jobs are gone.
Yeah, we're seeing more and more of that. And even since this current administration came in with the federal jobs that are being cut, like when you're looking at DC, Maryland, Virginia, and that community, a lot of people have federal jobs. So we're going to start seeing that impact of that many jobs being removed from the area. There's a town in West Virginia where there was I believe it was a military base or something that closed down, and most of the people were employed there, and we're looking to see how does that impact. I remember when I went to visit St. Vincent and Grenadines with regards to legalization. Um, there was Dole used to have banana production there, and when Dole pulled out, it collapsed that part of St. Vincent. They collapsed the entire economy. What are people going to do now? Some of these things that were these jobs or these companies were reliant on are multi-generational jobs, like all the plants and things like that. What do people do in those situations? So the times they are changing, and we saw the same thing with regards to what happens in New York as well.
So what was the turning point? Now, so as you go from the 70s, what was the turning point that led to medical cannabis being put into effect in New York State?
Yeah, I think one of the main turning points has to do with in the middle of Prohibition, having this Hemp for Victory campaign. So when we went to war and we needed, quick access to textiles, quick access to rope, there was a rolling back of the prohibition, and we called it Hemp for Victory. So now it's okay because we need it, because we do know trees take 20 years to grow. We do. So we're going to allow you to grow hemp again. I think that kind of awakened in people, like, wait, is this bad or is it good? Is it good only during wartime kind of thing? So I think that created a record with a certain generation that it may not be so bad. And then we have these, people who've been activists for many, many years. I was talking to Alice, and she's part of the Patients Out of Time, I would say, crew back in the day. She had a cannabis case in 1976 to end the prohibition of cannabis. So we're actually, releasing our Road to 30 podcast or Patients Out of Time, and we're talking to like real OGs that actually had legit, like one had arrests in the 70s, but also had a legitimate court cases starting from 1976 requesting the rescheduling or descheduling of cannabis. Back then there wasn't the internet, so a lot of people don't know that history, and that's what we're trying to bring to the forefront are these I don't the pioneers more than vigilantes who really were just like, this is ridiculous, you need to legalize. But they were definitely targeted during that time. So I think their efforts were the beginning of the starting point. Also, with Patients Out of Time, they were the first nonprofit organization to have CMEs, in the world. And Mary Lynn Mathry, I get to work with her. And she's a nurse who decided, I'm just going to do education, and that also helped. So it was very difficult for her to even find a place that would host a cannabis convention back then. Now we have them all over the place, but it wasn't the case. To hold it at a university and have medical professionals actually attend, that was a great undertaking. So when we started, introducing the medical community to the medicinal benefits, that also was part of the turning point. We can't talk about turning point without talking about Dr. Meshulam in Israel and his work with regards, he's like the godfather of cannabinoids, but his work with regarding to identifying, cannabinoids and their use, that really fast forwarded, because then he's a respected researcher, and the world started taking notice. We're still not in a posture where cannabis is very prevalently taught in medical schools and nursing programs, but it's getting better over time. So I think winning over the medical community was a huge boost to our activism because there was a perception of stoner culture. So you counter that with like respected medical professionals giving their opining on the medicinal benefits. Also, again, the Rastafari community with their use, people going to Jamaica and indulging in cannabis and knowing that it's not harmful for them. I think the Rastafari community has not gotten enough credit for what we've done to be champions and wave the banner of cannabis is spiritual, medicinal, meditational, and has many, many uses. So I think also that cultural expansion has had a lot to do with the end of cannabis prohibition. Even in the DEA hearings that were supposed to start, I'm one of the attorneys representing Veterans Initiative 22. Even with that effort, the Department of Health and Human Services made their recommendation to the DEA. Cannabis is medicinal. Move it from a Schedule 1 to a Schedule 3. And they created this two-part test for CAMU, which is currently accepted medical uses. So the two-part test is, one part is, hey, we've had medicinal cannabis for over 20 years. Let's use that information and data from those medical professionals and those state authorized programs as far as, research and understanding. And then the other part of it is, what's the science saying? Because we've had scientific clinical studies on cannabis for many years now as well. And, using those two parts to make a case for the removal of cannabis from Schedule 1 and moving it to Schedule 3. I'm a deschedule or bust person, but I am representing and a pro for Schedule 3 as a starting point. But yeah, that's where we're headed, and we have enough data in our existing medical programs. We have enough data in the clinical trial programs to make that step. Do we need to know more about the plant? Yes. But we need to know more about fentanyl. We need to know more about, all these other medicines and drugs as well. So the research is going to continue and we'll become more informed and more educated. But, another turning point was the emergence of scientists who were curious, physicians who were curious, and all these cases where it may have been anecdotal, but people were being healed from cancer. People were having the stopping of their tremors with Parkinson's, and people were, their seizures were being abated based on use of cannabis. The Sanjay Gupta CNN series was also a critical part of that turning point. Charlotte's Web and rest in peace, Charlotte Fiegi. Just that little girl being presented on television and her seizure experience with cannabis versus without cannabis was very emotive for people. So in the time when, the early days of, I wouldn't say early days of prohibition, but early days of legalization from state to state, what would move people would be our sick kids, our veteran community, and then our fatally ill individuals and their stories about turning things around. That's really what moved people, changed minds and hearts. The veteran community is very persuasive, very active in this space. And how can you say no to someone who served our country, experienced horrors, and they're saying, I can't sleep without this. If I didn't have this, my family would not be together. I was in a movie called Unprescribed, filmed probably about 2017, 2018. It's on Amazon Prime for free. And that movie is about veterans and cannabis. And I'm not a veteran, but I've always felt like we have to advocate for them because we wouldn't have the ability to own a car, drive a car, have clean air, not know someone's not going to bust through your door at any moment, know that you're not going to be physically violated without the military. So even though I'm not, a veteran, I've always done advocacy for veterans. I, represented Bud for Vets. Mission Zero. I now represent Veterans Initiative 22, and I think that's really important work. So I think that's what moves hearts and minds is when you see someone who you have an affinity for, see someone that you can relate to, and you're like, how can I stop their harm? Let me change my mindset a little bit. Or sometimes they're just like, only for these people. And then we have to kind of back that out and say, it's actually not fair for you to say just only for these people. If you believe they can get it, then everybody else can get it too. So that's when we start seeing this era of responsible cannabis legalization, which is really exciting. And, I call this the golden era of cannabis legalization because when I first started, it was a little different as far as walking into legislators' offices and saying, hey, I'm here, I'm a cannabis activist.
So we go from the medical side now to the adult use side.
Yeah.
Plus 21, of course, the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act. What do you think of the social equity provisions that are in that statute, and then also the agency's implementation of those requirements?
Yeah, I think so. First of all, social equity is so critically needed. Social equity started murmuring, from Oakland, California. They were very proactive, cascaded across California. Sacramento started looking at Los Angeles and other cities in California. So we're hearing about it, reading about it on the East Coast, and hungering for that type of equity because when you look at the legacy community, it's very diverse. There's no more diverse environment than they said the most segregated point in an American week is on Sunday mornings, and the most integrated I think is sharing a spliff or indulging in cannabis. You'll see people from all different walks of life, where their careers are all different races, all different faiths. They can be consuming in the same space and think nothing of it. So I think that's like an important part of our culture. So social equity is necessary because when this emerging industry, legal industry started, we didn't see that representation, and a lot of the reason for that is because the laws. When we got to the point of legalization, we would see, okay, moms with sick kids. We see the veterans; they're going up to the capital in their state's capital and of the country, and then when the laws pass, when the licenses are given out, white male, white male, white male, white male, white male, white male. It's like who doesn't see that there's something wrong with this picture? Everyone needs access to this. And that's why social equity is so important. So I think the MRTA and the MRTA wasn't like an overnight thing. There were activists going to Albany year after year after year, working on this legislation, meeting with people, collaborating together as different organizations with different interests so that we can get here. I like the fact that we do have social equity. I like the categories. I think it should turn on harm, which that's where the Black and Brown community really needs to be represented and have opportunity. Those who are formerly incarcerated, I think that's the highest level of harm is your loss of freedom, and you can tie that loss of freedom directly to the plant. So I know the Office of Cannabis Management has been criticized for that card round, but when I've seen further rounds, if we didn't have card, we wouldn't have the diversity that we see today. Card was a very novel approach. It really hit at the point of these are the most harmed. These people who lost their freedom, some of them for hours, some of them for years, plucked out of their families' lives, missing marriages, funerals, births, missing all these things.
And impacting the entire family, not just that individual.
Impacting the
community.
Absolutely, impacting the whole family. And then you consider the treatment that they had while incarcerated. That's very different from when you're in freedom, right? So also looking to that and saying they really suffered and them getting a license, who would want to take that away from them? So I really like not only how legislatively we've created these categories of, Black and brown people, so minority, women, service disabled veterans, and communities disproportionately impacted by cannabis prohibition. That's the most important one. We haven't seen the participation that we're hoping to. The OCM did a very dynamic, amazing, shout out to Tabitha Robinson and her team. She's moved on to Maryland now. God bless her. But, that social equity report that came out for last year, you can see in that data where we've been and where we're going. So I am a fan of the New York program. I have done most of my work in Florida. We are light years behind New York and this Northeast corridor in Florida. Social equity isn't even a consideration. I was a writer of the first social equity bill for the state of Florida, and we still don't have anything close to social equity there. What are the barriers, and why is New York so great? So one of the barriers is cost of an application. The application fees in New York have been consistently in the adult use side very reasonable, starting with the $2,000 for the card round to going down to, if you are of meet a social equity requirement, going down to $500 for the next adult use round. That is something that you can afford. That is something you can go to your family and say, hey, let's put money together and do this. Whereas, in Florida, it's of upwards of $140,000 non-refundable application fee. How do you pitch that to somebody? So how do you pitch that? So that's one of the barriers that I think New York's done a great job overcoming. I think the support from the Office of Cannabis Management with regards to being accessible, I think I haven't seen that level of accessibility anywhere else except for probably New Jersey. I think New York and New Jersey are tied as far as, the approachability and availability of the regulatory staff. You see them everywhere, like literally everywhere. I participate in OCM's faith-based conversations once a month. I know that Julian Vincent and Nev, they're going to have a conversation with us, Rastafari community, Christian community, Judaic community, Hindu community, Muslim community, and we're going to talk about what they're doing with regards to cannabis, our concerns with regards to cannabis, just that type of, consideration. You don't see that all of the time. So that's another thing that I think is very positive about the rollout in New York. As far as, funding, there was an attempt with the DASNY program because, again, this social equity, I always say social equity is an evolution. So there's a state, then they're like, oh, so when it first rolled out, I was like, oh, now there's all these straw man situations. They're getting, black faces to represent these companies. They're really white and things like, how do we repair that? And then we saw like Chicago really took that to heart. They also took to heart the challenge with the application fees. They had fee waivers and things like that. People are being innovative. People are being good intentioned as regulators. Then from, what we saw in, I said Chicago, so Illinois, then we come over to the East Coast and then New York says, hey, in the challenge that they're having in Illinois is people are holding on to their properties for 2 years and they haven't even heard anything yet. So let's see if we can fix that. It was a bit of a false start, but the intention was good, right? And we have to think of it as an evolution. And we have to remember, Lauryn Hill says something in her Unplugged album. She says that, there's a reason that we have a steering wheel in a car so that before we hit a wall, we're able to turn around. And that always stayed with me because you don't have to be right in the beginning. You just have to be curious in the beginning. And then you have to have a process for collecting data so that you can make the most informed, responsible decision. And I think based on the data that was available and what was presented as far as the capabilities of DASNY, that was a responsible decision. Were there other implications with regards to interest rate and payback periods and how you work with private lenders and things like that? Absolutely. We've all learned from that. But I think the intention of repairing what other states have experienced as far as, the long holding on to properties situation, it was a good attempt. And I was really excited when it first came out
No, and
until You know, either some people didn't want the properties, or there was the terms were challenging. So we learned from that. Now people are back where you have to figure out how you're going to get your property on your own, and people are complaining. I've been waiting 2 years. I've been waiting a year. I've held on to that property. You can't have both. You're either going to get a property, and then we have to figure out the terms thing. And the sad part is, because there was so much, negative media and press around the DASNY program, I any New York regulator would be afraid to try it again. But I think there was a way to kind of like fine tune it and make it work. But we didn't give them that opportunity, because it was just like kind of like a slash and cut for it. So now we're back to where people have been holding on to properties for over a year, because the decision making process, the rollout process, takes time. That is something that you cannot get around unless you're going to be overstaffed. So unless you bring in temporary staff, but when you bring in a large amount of temporary staff, how do you ensure that they are making consistent, responsible decisions? You can bring in more people and process applications faster, but have you trained them the right way? Are they the right people for the job? Are you mitigating litigation issues later? Or do you have like a sound, solid staff that you give them time to work through, so you have that consistent output, you mitigate your litigation risk, and everybody was treated the same and fairly, right?
And we talked a lot about the need for. I mean, obviously for additional staff, temporary staff would not have worked. There's just in that process would not have worked.
Right.
The agency today is about 235 full-time staff, and should actually be, probably more than double. I mean, that's an agency that should be at 500.
Right.
But let's not talk about that. What you mentioned one thing that has not been part of the conversation was also that period of time, 2022, 2023, interest rates were soaring at that time.
Yeah.
Which also, I think, impacted the program. It hasn't been part of the discussion, but that should have impacted the way the program was rolled out, because just the interest rates just made it unattractive. But we could spend just a tremendous amount of time talking about this stuff, you and I.
Absolutely.
So we need to wrap up. So just wanted to ask you, because you're
Yeah.
so knowledgeable.
Well, thank you.
What advice would you have for OCM now? The governor, the legislature, right? This is the
Yep.
main time when the legislature and the governor's office are negotiating. Any advice for continuing the progress, but really sort of battening down and making this program work?
Yeah, I think definitely we need more funding for staffing for the Office of Cannabis Management, so that they can, now that we've optimized how they do the work, we need more people to do it faster. I think that's pretty basic, straightforward. Continue the work around faith-based communities. I think we should prioritize faith-based communities, because if they need to own the chain of custody for it to be considered sacramental, they can't go into anyone else's dispensary. So we need to kind of build out that framework for the faith-based users, including Rastafari, Hindu community. So I'm curious to see what that will look like. Legacy community, there's been a very strong embrace of legacy community, but we need to figure out a way to, now that we've defined it. So myself, through ASTM with Unlock, there's a definition that's going through the ASTM battling process. So we know how to define our legacy community, prioritize them, because they have that experience. They can get up and running fairly quickly, as long as there's funding. And then the last part is, I would look to the New Jersey grant program. It's been successful. It's well received. The press is good. Don't reinvent the wheel. If you have a neighbor that has rolled out grants of $250,000 in the first round, $150,000 in the second round, they're utilizing their Secretary of State for the NJBAC program. That's unprecedented, but it's working. So let's really take notes with regards to that, and create a robust grant program, so that these new cannabis business executives have the funding to execute on what they said in their application. So, and they're less vulnerable to predatory predatory attacks from industry. There's a lot of predatory stuff going on. I see it as a lawyer. I do the best I can for my clients, but we need to make sure there's funding for legal counsel when people are taking on this type of endeavor. It's a benefit for everyone for you to have a lawyer, lawyers who care, good lawyers who really will be working for that person's side. So I think that's a easy fix. I don't think that's I think that's low hanging fruit is really saying, and I think Maryland has done something recently where they're giving $14,000 for consultation or legal services. And I think that's a best practice that should be cascaded throughout the country and specifically rolled out in New York to kind of mitigate some of the predatory stuff that we unfortunately see going on.
All right. Thank you. Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure to have you on.
It's been awesome. Thank you. We went through Prohibition, Reefer Madness, Hemp for Victory, and, all the way to the MRTA and beyond. So
Mayor Cyril LaGuardia, how many cannabis conversations included mention of?
That report was phenomenal. Yeah, thank you for doing that research. A lot of people don't know about the LaGuardia report, but even the CARICOM a couple of years ago did their own report, and it's prohibition is costly and it's disastrous for society. It's been proven time and again. So we need to just close the door on prohibition and really look at how we can build an economy from the cannabis market. And an economy from providing people with health and wellness.
All right. Well, thank you. I'll let you go so you can go teach debate to your son's class.
I look forward to it. That's my every week. I love it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. That's it for this episode of Joint Session Diverse Voices in New York State Cannabis. If you found today's discussion valuable, consider leaving a rating and review on your favorite podcast platform. It helps more listeners find the show. Better yet, share it with colleagues, advocates, and anyone interested in the future of cannabis in New York. Joint Session is produced by me, Herb Barbot, together with executive producer Robert Curtis from SimLev Media. Special thanks as always to Cannabis Wire. You can follow us on Instagram at jointsession.pod and on LinkedIn at Joint Session Podcast. If you have any comments, questions, or topic suggestions, reach out to me at herb.jointsession@gmail.com. Until next time, this is Herb Barbot. Thanks for listening.